Thank you so very much for being here to celebrate Taj McCoy releasing her new romance novel, The Good Ones Are Taken. Oakland-born law grad Taj McCoy is committed to championing stories that include Black and multiracial women of color, plus-size protagonists, Black love, Black joy, and strong senses of sisterhood and familial bond. Taj started writing as a child, enjoying her first publications in elementary school. Her most recent works include Savi Sheldon's Feeling Good as Hell and Zora Books' Her Happy Ever After. I also want to note that Taj was one of our first in-person events when we got back to in-person events after the pandemic, and that was at our other Union Market location, so we're really thrilled to have her back. She also edited the steamy rom-com anthology, Even If the Sky is Falling. When she's not writing, Taj may be on Twitter, boosting other marginalized writers, practicing yoga, sharing recipes, or cooking private supper club meals for her close friends. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Taj McCoy.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's so good to see your faces. Oh, goodness. So, just to start, I like to start these conversations kind of with that elevator pitch, right? What is the story about? So, The Good Ones Are Taken is a friends to lovers romance. It is a continuation of Savvy Sheldon Feels Good as Hell. So if you happen to read that one, then you'll be aware that Savvy has two best friends, Joan and Maggie. And Maggie is the one that's in question here. Maggie Jones is in a slump, and you'll get to see that firsthand momentarily. But she's in a slump. She needs to find a date to her best friend's weddings because they're both now engaged. And you have this great moment of kind of retribution for Savvy because Savvy got forced into online dating by Maggie in the first book. So now we're at a point where Maggie has to do the same. She gets forced by her besties, and they're like, you have to take your own medicine now. And so in this, she goes on several really bad dates with people that she's met online before she meets a guy who happens to be almost everything that she's looking for. He's a heart surgeon. He's really sexy. She meets him at the gym, so she knows what he's working with. And we get this sense that there's potential. But there's just one problem. Her best friend from college, Garrett, he's had feelings for her all along, and he just never said anything. And so he kind of drops a bomb on her as she's starting to try to get a little more serious with Blake. And it leaves her in a tailspin where she has to decide, is it worth the risk to possibly find love with her best friend? And so in doing so, now they've got to explore what that might look like together. And so that's the story. It is one of those where it was fun to kind of jump right back into the Savvyverse and have those friends back and really give closure to the readers who had been able to, kind of enjoy Savvy's journey and then now get to see what happens with Maggie and also get closure now on Savvy and Spencer, on Joni and Beth, and see, how those pairings really do have their happy ever after. And so tonight, I'm going to share with you the first chapter of The Good Ones Are Taken before I share a little bit more, and then I'll open up to questions. And so thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So chapter 1. Her eyes locked with another pair on the other side of the bar, deep brown eyes framed with black curly lashes and bookended with laugh lines. Maggie's heart flopped in her chest as she inhaled a breath, almost willing the scent of his cologne to travel the 15 feet to where she sat. He looks like he smells good. The man looked back at her, eyeing her intently. His long locks were pulled back into a messy bun, random tendrils reaching toward his bearded jawline, a lone streak of silver to one side of his manicured chin. His full lips spread into a wide smile bright enough for a toothpaste ad, and he raised 2 fingers in the air before beckoning her over. He jutted his thumb towards a booth behind him where the table was set with a bottle of champagne on ice and 2 empty flutes. Maggie's eyebrows shot up as she pointed to herself. "Me?" she mouthed. His smile widened, and he bit his lip as he nodded slowly. The carnal look in his eyes spread warmth to her belly. She swiveled her bar stool to the side, a moment from stepping down and crossing the room before she caught a glimpse of the woman standing directly behind her. Late 20s, svelte, and a dress that hugged every curve of a Coke bottle figure. She had deep dimples, and her honey blonde goddess locks were pulled up and away from her face, showing off her sparkling green eyes and fluttering lashes. The woman strode to the other side of the bar confidently in stiletto sandals tied just below muscular calves. The sexy, locked-up couple embraced tightly, kissing twice before they slid into the booth and poured themselves some bubbles. They snuggled close as he raised his glass to the occasion, his beautiful date beaming as they clinked their glasses together and tenderly locked lips. Damn, strike one. Maggie turned back to the bar, sipping the final dregs of her cocktail before running her fingers over the glass of her water. The ice had melted and the glass was slick with condensation. With the pad of her finger, she drew a figure 8 before dabbing it on a cocktail napkin. She opened her mouth to ask the bartender Matt for her check when someone spoke behind her. "Anyone sitting here?" The rich baritone voice sent a delicious shiver down the back of her neck. Maggie peeked coyly over her shoulder, her right brow arching slightly as her eyes swept over the tall specimen behind her. The man wore a tailored black suit with a loosened silk tie and a white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His easy smile widened as she regarded him. "Seat's all yours." She responded slowly, her voice a sultry whisper as she swept a loose coil behind her ear. She turned back toward the counter, sending an amused wink in the direction of the bartender. "Thanks." He slid onto the bar stool and unfastened his tie, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Matt nodded a greeting. "Hey man, looks like you could use a drink. What can I get you?" "Yeah, let me get a Maker's Mark Old Fashioned and another drink for the lady." The handsome stranger tilted his head in Maggie's direction, turning to observe her. His salt and pepper fade contoured down to a closely cut beard, a few grays speckled the sections framing his mouth. Matt nodded and set to making the drinks. Maggie eyed the man next to her, notes of spiced oud and sandalwood invading her senses from his cologne. "Thank you." "What are you drinking?" He crossed his arms, setting his elbows on the bar. He leaned toward her slightly, pointing to her empty cocktail glass. "A filthy gin martini, extra olives." She accepted a fresh glass from Matt and took a slow sip, savoring the briny liquid. Her heel crooked over the stool's footrest. She flexed her foot and pointed her toe, her feet still sore from enduring a long day of meetings. She'd braved the day in her favorite Cole Haan pumps, mistakenly deciding that she didn't need to carry her customary pair of flats in her laptop tote. Never again. "Long day?" She eyed him curiously, the stem of her martini glass between her index and middle fingers, her palm flat against its cool foot. Slowly, she swirled the contents of her drink, her shoulders finally beginning to relax, courtesy of Tanqueray. He nodded. "You could say that. Divorce mediations. You?" "Tax attorney, and it's near April." Maggie sipped slowly, willing the gin not to take hold of her too quickly. "I'm sorry about your marriage." His brow lifted. "How did you know the settlement was mine? I could be the attorney." She pursed her lips, considering the statement before shrugging a shoulder. "You could, but your thumb keeps rubbing against the space between your middle and ring finger like you're missing something." The bartender slid over a glass tumbler filled with an oversized ice cube, amber liquid, and an orange peel. The man took a big gulp before jutting his chin upward in thanks. "I guess as an attorney you know all the tales." Her face softened slightly. "Not all of them, but I've seen enough to know it's not going well." "Sorry." His shoulders slumped a little. "Not your fault. All mine, really." He took another gulp, almost finishing his drink, gazing at her in her cream pantsuit and camel pumps. He leaned a little closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "This may be forward of me, but you're a very beautiful woman. Would you maybe want to get out of here?" He raised his eyebrows as he pressed his lips together. Maggie's eyes widened as she sputtered, almost choking on her cocktail. Damn, you just go straight for the ass, huh? Shocked, he laughed awkwardly. Wow, I'm so sorry. I didn't think about what I was saying until it came out of my mouth. Please don't be offended. My eyes were immediately drawn to you when I walked in, and honestly, I've been out of the game for a long time. He put his hand to his chest to apologize, frustration furrowing his brows. Maggie tilted her head as she employed the poker face she used with her clients, her gaze moving back and forth between her drink and the bartender, who had frozen at the proposition. Well, I appreciate the compliment and the drink, but I'm going to have to pass. I'm not really the type to bust it open when I don't know your name, we're not dating, and you're still married. That's a lot to ask of a stranger. She shook her head, chronicling this proposition among the many things she intended to share with her girlfriends over dinner. Who does that? The man pressed his lips together and nodded, chuckling. You're right, and I'm sorry. My wife and I, we've been living separate lives for a long time, though I can understand why it still sounds fresh. I didn't mean any harm. Maggie smiled at her drink and flipped her wrist at him. All good. Thanks for the drink. Honestly, I'm still getting over my own breakup, so I wouldn't make great company tonight. The man turned his entire body to face her, his knees bumping the outside of her thigh. Do you want to talk about it? I'm obviously not a relationship expert, but I can listen. Sweet Jesus, that was not an invitation. She shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Not tonight, but thank you. It had been a few months since Rob left, and the sting of his betrayal still burned right below the surface of Maggie's skin. She thought they were getting close to moving in together, but he had already set his sights on someone else. Now she wanted nothing more than to junk punch him in front of his new girl. Too embarrassed by the fact that he chose someone else, she preferred to brood over a cocktail rather than air out her hurt, even though her eyes had opened to the potential for someone new. Just not this guy. Being in the midst of divorce proceedings didn't exactly signal emotional availability. Now, if only he would take a hint. The door opened and a couple of women breezed toward a high-top table in dark corporate suits, their identical bobs parting bone-straight hair with recent highlights. Maggie's neighbor perked up and she prayed silently for his departure. Will you excuse me? I think I recognize someone, he murmured, his eyes never leaving the newcomers. Of course. Thanks again. Maggie raised her glass and watched with amusement as he moved quickly across the room and greeted the pair, neither of whom seemed to recognize him. That didn't stop him from planting himself at their table, oblivious to the panicked look on their faces. Maggie winked at Matt, who rested his hands on the bar, an easy smile spreading across his face. That was a lot. She rested her chin in her hand, shaking her head as she laughed. He whistled in agreement. One more for the road, Mags? On me. You deserve it after whatever that was. She grinned. You know what, Matt? I think I'm going to save myself from strike 3 and head on home. Can you cash me out? You got it. Thanks, Mags, as he handed her a tab. Uh-huh. Maggie's eyes were drawn across the bar again to the booth that could have been, the locked couple entwined and oblivious to the world around them. Their lips and hands were in constant movement, connecting fervently. And when they broke apart to breathe, the intensity of their gazes told everyone in the room what time it was. These two were going to ravish each other, probably before they even made it home. Their kisses made Maggie ache low in her stomach. I want that. Maggie stepped into her Santa Monica condo and immediately kicked off her shoes as she shut the front door. Penny. The communal living space was open concept. Maggie loved a great room. A giant U-shaped couch faced a mounted flat-screen TV. Behind the sofa, bar stools framed the kitchen island. A floor-to-ceiling wall of windows on one side held bifold doors that led to a long balcony. On the other side of the couch was an eating nook and a hallway leading to Maggie's bedroom and her home office. The wood floors felt cold against her aching feet as she removed her blazer and hung it on one of the back of the bar stools. I know you're hungry. Where are you? She crossed into the kitchen, the travertine tiles even colder against her skin. Maggie reached into the pantry for a package of Fancy Feast. Meow. A fuzzy shadow of Penny slinking into the living room appeared. No doubt she spent most of her day sprawled on Maggie's king-size bed. A Himalayan with deep gray face and paws and big blue eyes. Her snub-nosed glare could rival the resting bitch face of any local celebrity. She'd been the surly kitten when Maggie adopted her, the only one at the shelter who stood away from the others with an incessant fuck-around-and-find-out face. A girl after Maggie's own heart. It was love at first scowl. "Hello, my lovely. Did you have a good day?" Maggie crooned. Penny leaped onto the bar stool and hoisted herself onto the island counter, nuzzling the palm of Maggie's open hand as she stepped toward her saucer. She tapped a paw on the plate and looked up at Mags as if to say, "What are you waiting for?" "Okay." Maggie grabbed a spoon from a drawer and ladled half of the portion into the tray into Penny's dish. Once she tapped the spoon on the plate to drop the last morsel, Penny licked her lips and went to work. Maggie ran her fingernails along Penny's back and tail, accumulating a small ball of fur which she tossed in the trash under the sink. "We need to have a good brushing session this weekend, ma'am." Penny eyed her for a brief moment before returning to her meal. Maggie held up her hands and walked away slowly, heading down the hall to the bedroom. As she walked, she untucked her camisole from her slacks, easing it over her head and throwing it into a hamper in her walk-in closet. After unzipping her pants, she stepped out of them and dropped them in a pile for the dry cleaner. She unfastened her bra, relieving her full breasts from their wiry detention, and exhaled happily. Once she brushed and pinned up her hair, wrapping it in a silk scarf, Maggie dropped salts and tulip-scented bubble bath in her tub, running hot water and humming to herself. "Hey, Alexa, play the Wind Down playlist." Now playing Wind Down. Goapele's Closer began to play softly through the speakers that Maggie recently had mounted into her walls. She tugged her lacy thong down and off, examined herself in the mirror before washing her face carefully, trying not to disturb her lash extensions. She patted her face dry with a fresh towel before easing into her steaming cloud of bubbles, the fragrance and heat easing her muscles as she sat and relaxed. Maggie rested her neck against a soft pillow at the lip of her tub, allowing the hot water and bath salts to melt away her aches and the stress of tax season. Exhaling deeply, she let go of the day, but the couple in the booth clung to the edges of her thoughts, and she wondered what they had gotten into as she lathered her body with a rich cleanser and exfoliating gloves. After her bath, she sat on a teak bench and slathered body butter over her brown skin, still unable to shake the couple from her mind. Flashes of them kissing and pawing at each other ran through her head, and she closed her eyes, imagining that those lips and hands were on her own body. The two were equally sexy, so she let her mind wander as she considered what it would be like to experience the two of them together. Maggie had never been with a woman, but that didn't mean she hadn't thought about it. She pulled a silk robe over her shoulders and padded toward her bed, stooping to pull her favorite purple toy from the bottom drawer of her nightstand. Maggie climbed on top of the fluffy white comforter and leaned back against her pillows propped up against her upholstered headboard. Her robe fell open, and she squeezed her eyes shut, imagining the man with his megawatt smile running his lips down her neck to her chest as the tendrils of his hair tickled her bare skin. She grazed the flattened tip of her G-spot stimulator against each spot where she imagined his partner's lips connecting with her flesh, biting her lip as the toy traveled lower. She eased her legs apart, rubbing the toy against the seam of her folds, allowing it to slicken with the moisture building at her core. Maggie's mouth fell open as she gasped. Pressing the small round panel on the front of the device, the toy began to hum at a low frequency. Turning its tip back against her skin, she eased small circles as she increased the settings with her thumb from a light hum to a heavier pulse. Maggie swore as her hips reacted, winding slowly as her inner thighs began to shake. Delicious pressure and heat began to build at her apex as she undulated against the device. As Maggie's back began to arch and her head pressed deeper into the pillows, the toy sputtered and stopped abruptly. "What? No!" Maggie shrieked, pressing her face into one of her satin-covered pillows. Strike 3. Maggie whined, dramatically tossing a pillow across the room before pushing herself off the bed and wrapping her robe around her waist. She trudged back out toward the kitchen, thighs slick with arousal, unable to remember where she'd stashed her damn charging cable. She grabbed a bag of popcorn from the pantry and threw it in the microwave until the series of pops began to fade. Grumbling, she sat on the couch next to Penny, who had sprawled out on Maggie's favorite throw blanket. Penny eyed Maggie before closing her eyes as if to say, "Don't start none, won't be none." Ignoring the glare, Maggie turned on the television to her favorite comfort show, Living Single. She loved that she could stream it whenever she wanted, and her favorite singles could surely relate to all the foolery she'd faced that day. She tucked a few kernels of buttery popcorn into her mouth as she watched the scene unfold but she had forgotten that the last episode she started was the series finale. Her mouth dropped open as Kyle and Max happily went home together after accepting that their baby would tie them together forever, and Regine was engaged to her rich guy, and Sinclair and Overton were happy, and now Khadijah finally had Scooter? Ugh, all of these bitches end up happy. Where's mine? Penny sat up, her stare shooting daggers in Maggie's direction for the disturbance. She leapt off the couch and sauntered toward her bed in Maggie's office where she could relax in peace. Maggie watched her leave as the TV auto-streamed The Golden Girls as final credits rolled. Even the TV is judging me. I'm gonna die alone, she muttered, shoving more popcorn into her mouth. And that is the end of chapter 1. So, as you can see, Maggie is obviously in a slump. She's curious about finding someone, but she's not really ready to take a step, and so she has to get pressured by her friends to do so. In connecting this story to Savvy, one of the biggest goals that I had was, to make sure that Maggie's character from Savvy really stands out. Savvy had this shaken confidence because of the breakup that she experienced at the beginning of the book. Maggie was this friend of hers who was loud and proud and colorful and, was unapologetic about who she was. In this story, Maggie is still that girl, but her flaw is that she doesn't like to be vulnerable. She doesn't like to admit that she's ooey gooey and soft on the inside. And the one person that sees that and recognizes that more so than almost anyone else is Garrett, her best friend. Savvy sees it too, but Savvy's way of calling it out is a little harsher than Garrett's. Garrett is nice about it. Savvy could care less about being nice at this point because Maggie has never been nice. And so it's one of those things where you get a sense of not only this friend group and how it has evolved over time, but also, in terms of Maggie and this friendship that she's had for almost 20 years, in what ways she might be willing to see that friendship grow and change, or is she going to try to keep it the same, but does she risk losing that friend either way, right? If she chooses to go and try something with him, she could lose him. If she chooses not to and ultimately breaks his heart, she could also lose him. So she's in a catch-22, trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. I've been told by people who read it that they get frustrated and want to kind of strangle her a little bit, but that's on purpose. I wanted that character to have the flaws, to question herself, and to question her motives for doing what she was doing. And in doing so, it gives you that feel of, I'm caught in this situation. I'm pretty sure I know what I want, but I'm scared to go after it. And I think that is going to be something that's relatable. In thinking about writing, are there any writers in the room? Okay, yeah. So I am a Capricorn, which means I am extremely anal about everything that I do. I make spreadsheets for everything, and I'm definitely a plotter. To the point where I will draft a synopsis and then plug it into a spreadsheet because, again, spreadsheet love, before even attempting to write any of my story. This time around, writing was a little bit difficult for me. I was having some health things go on, and I was in my own head, and I was staring at a blank page for a lot longer than I had in previous books. And so I decided to take it to a different medium. And instead of staring at that screen, I just turned on voice memos, and I started to talk it out and transcribe it. And that actually ended up working for me pretty well. And so it's been interesting to kind of see how writing changes from one book to the next. You would kind of think that at some point you fall into a process, but I find that every book presents different challenges, and they have to be faced based on whatever's going on at the time. I'm actually working on the book that comes out next spring, which is currently called The Dating Prohibition, and I'll tell you all about that one a little bit, but that one, I basically dictated the whole thing. I could not look at the page. I could not stare at that blank screen. It was triggering my anxiety. And I was just like, I couldn't do it. And so I decided to try that new thing and actually did that for the entire book, which is something that I didn't even think was possible. I dictated about 300 pages of material, but it actually went a lot faster than I thought too. This book was written in less than a month, and so that's pretty fast. It's very stressful also. But the dating prohibition is based here in DC. It is a best friend's brother romance. And so this one's going to be a lot of fun. What I love most about it is I'm incorporating some of the historic parts of DC in this one. So the main character's name is, why am I blanking? Kendra. Her family lovingly calls her Kiki, and she's trying to get them to stop. Her brother Logan is one of her closest confidants, and he and his wife Shonda have opened a restaurant in DC. And her goal is to open a speakeasy-style lounge with a supper club in the back. And so the supper club portion is going to be that part that has the password access. And so you have to have a special reservation, a password to get into the dining room. But the bar itself will be, open all the time. And so her goal is to open this bar in an area that's near where her brother's business is so that they can support each other and send clientele back and forth to each other. The only problem is she keeps coming up against obstacles and challenges in trying to solidify a location and trying to gain the funding. And she gets really frustrated because she's finding that every time she gets a little bit closer to meeting her goal, something else gets in the way. And Logan's best friend, BJ, is the love interest. He is a professor of historic preservation, and so he does research on historic buildings, and he's currently on sabbatical doing a bunch of research for his next book. This gives him a great opportunity to go and look at a bunch of different properties with her, because he's doing it for research and because she needs someone else who can talk to her about these different locations. Now, what happens basically is one night as her brother's restaurant is about to open, they have a moment where they almost kiss, and he says, "I can't, you're off limits." And she says who? Did my brother say that? And of course he didn't. BJ just decided that they were in the same circle and he didn't want to take the risk. And so she agrees to that begrudgingly. But of course, as luck would have it, alcohol allows certain things to happen. And what goes from a random late night hookup after too much to drink turns into a password protected moment of sneaky links. And so it's almost a speakeasy version, if you will, of hooking up until things come to a head and she has to decide what to do with her business. And so what's fun about that story in particular that I'm finding so far is it's different than the other things that I've written. It's not connected to anything. However, there are some Easter eggs, of course, that tie the location of the story to Zora. If you happen to read that one, that is my other DC book that is a love triangle for a bookseller who has a crush on an author, and she dates him and his best friend. And so there's some fun to be had in these stories, but I'm finding that especially as these books grow and as I grow as a writer, I'm leaning into new conventions and trying new things with each one. And so that's that. That's what's next. Although, for those that did read Zora and remember that friend group, I decided that on the indie side, I'm planning to release this summer a novella for Emma, Zora's best friend, Emma has been dating guys primarily. She's bi. She's got a bit of a rotation when it comes to men because she basically thinks they're all fuckboys. And so what she does is she says, I do want to date a woman, but I'm not ready for that until I'm ready to fall in love. She does not put women in that same category of fuckboy. And so she's like, now that she's moving out because Zora's guy is moving in, she has to go and find her own. And so she happens to fall for her landlady in her new building. And she's not ready for love, the landlady. Her name is Sadie. And so it's going to be an interesting push and pull because even though she's not ready, of course, there's the hookup. And now I've got to deal with the aftermath of that. But that is scheduled to come out in early July. And so stay tuned for announcements for that. But yeah, I'm happy to open to questions now. Yes, sir.
So I have two questions. One, when?
Yeah, we're recording. Yeah.
For my first song, I will no. So, first question: when can I schedule you to read the rest of the book to me? Because it just gave a certain coloring to it that I thought was very helpful. So you can tell that it's a very intimate story for you. Like there's
Yeah.
passion that I think is very helpful in telling the story. But then it led me to the second question.
Okay.
How do you know when you've given enough depth to a character?
Yeah.
So that it breathes life into them and that they can actually stand and move through the pages on their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that a lot because as I'm building a character, I pretty much let them introduce themselves to me as I'm writing them. A lot of writers, what they'll do is they'll kind of have these character Bibles where they've defined all of these characteristics of someone before they even start writing. And I don't really do that. Instead, I kind of let them reveal themselves to me as they're coming out on the page. And then as I go into revisions, I look to build them out more because I really want them to feel like three-dimensional people. I want them to have complex things about them. I want everybody to have things that are going well and things that they're struggling with. I want you to be able to see kind of the push and pull of how the different things that they've experienced influence the decisions that they make. And so in doing that, I try to be really mindful, right? Like in this particular book, everybody has already met Savvy, Maggie, and Joan, and Beth. And so it's easy to kind of build on it because a lot of the foundation's already there. But because now we're coming from Maggie's perspective, you get to see some of the things that Maggie hides behind her own shield. And so that was really intentional. I wanted for people who loved her in the first book and saw her as this super strong, loud and proud character to see that some of it's a facade. And really, it's for self-preservation purposes. She doesn't want people to know that she has what she perceives to be a weakness. And you see it play out a little bit because she's really close with her father. And her father is a big proponent of therapy. And so sometimes they'll have these phone calls and he'll be like, are the intrusive thoughts winning? Like, what's happening right now? And so there are moments where you get the sense that they have been on a journey dealing with mental health and making sure that they're covered and are equipped to handle things as they come, whatever the stressors may be. But for each of the characters, Garrett included, I wanted to make it so that you get a sense of where they're from. You get a sense of who their people are and how they're supported or not supported. You get a sense of what they're afraid of and what makes them nervous, but you also get a sense of what makes them really happy and how they kind of look at each other within the friend group. The different ways that they appreciate each other and the different ways that they kind of either ride for each other or call each other out. And the reason with this particular friend group that I did that was I also wanted to show a friendship group where there wasn't that toxicity of competition. I wanted it to be where it's like, all of us are friends here. If you're going through it, I'm immediately there. But if you're doing something really stupid, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to call you out because you need to stop it. And I wanted it to be one of those situations where, you know, like I have some friends like that in this room right now. But like I really wanted to make it feel like these people could be living, breathing people that you would just walk right past on the street. I didn't want it to feel like people were lacking in a way where they didn't feel like real people. I'm always aiming for that real feel. And it's funny because I get feedback on that sometimes from readers because, you know, romance is an escape, right? It's meant to help you feel good. It's meant to help you meet some expectations in terms of happy ever after and that love story feel. And some people really go for it in a sense of, you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with anybody. There's no flaws. There's no anything. But to me, I just don't find that interesting. I think it's a lot. It makes me a lot happier when I feel like I can really relate to these people on a human level. And so that's why I write them the way that I do. Yeah.
I really loved the dynamic of Savvy and her friends.
Thank you.
And I was curious, did you plan, when you were writing Savvy, did you imagine writing like one of her friends' stories, or did that kind of come later?
It actually came later. When I first sold Savvy, I did have a 2-book deal, but I was aware that my publisher wanted me to write something else because they wanted to see how Savvy did first in terms of sales. But once we could see that Savvy was doing pretty well, I was like, you know, I just feel like there's something that we could do for Maggie, and really bring people back into that world. And so many people asked for Maggie to have a story that we just couldn't leave them hanging. People were literally writing to my publisher. People were DMing me. There was one woman who literally was like emailing me through my website, like, what are you doing? Where's Maggie's story? Hurry up. And so we wanted to make sure that we, you know, tried to also get there for the fans. But it's definitely, I loved that so many people were in love with Maggie in the first story.
Thanks. Sorry for being late. So 2 questions. One is a really simple, probably basic question.
Yeah.
About the names of characters. Like I'm always curious when I'm reading a book, why an author chooses to use the names that they use. I mean, some of them are cute and cliquish or, you know, or timely, but I'm always curious about that. Then the other thing is something you were saying in response to him about, I guess, how do you balance like this idea that, you know, when you're writing, like he said, like, oh, you can tell this is intimate or personal.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I'm like, I would die. Like, but I know that's why you choose to write in some ways, right? But how do you kind of balance the idea that you want to tell these stories while also, you know, being vulnerable enough to kind of get it out there and connect with your readers, while also, I guess, in some ways protecting yourself in some ways and your own privacy, I guess.
Yeah.
That's a lot. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's great.
Okay.
So on the names first, I am very intentional with what I name my characters. Savvy, her name came to me immediately. I knew exactly what I wanted to name her, and it was purposeful. A lot of times when I'm looking at characters and trying to build them out, I actually don't write until I have named them. They have to have their names first, which is weird probably, because I know a lot of people instead will just kind of put a placeholder for someone's name until they figured it out. But literally when I write the synopsis, before I've even started plotting the book, I know their names, all of them. And so for me, I'm thinking about nicknames, I'm thinking about pet names, I'm thinking about voice, I'm thinking about where they're from, and how those things might play into it. I think about how old they are and what those generations' popular names might be. For Savvy, Savannah was actually really a popular name around that time. And so I was like, okay, well, everybody would call her Savvy for short or Savs, and that made sense to me. Maggie, in the first book, everybody knows her as Maggie or Mags. It wasn't until the second book that I decided that it was short for Magnolia. And so, because I was like, Margaret, I don't really want to do that to her. Magnolia just feels right. And so I came up with a backstory for why she had that name. And it was her mom's second favorite flower. And so, and her mom has passed away. And so there's all of these things that you kind of start to create as you're building out those characters, right? Like that backstory piece and how these things fit together. And I kind of liken it to a giant puzzle and just finding where everything fits. And sometimes parts of the background don't fit and you leave it off the page. But other things, you can find ways to kind of work it in where it makes sense. And it just kind of creates even more of a richness and a backstory to it. For the vulnerability part, as several of you in the audience know, my dating life is crazy. And I have stories galore, but I would never put my own name on those. And so instead, I attach them to my characters because a lot of times things will happen and people don't actually think that these are real stories or that they could happen in real life, but if you've met me, you know they do. And so like it's fun for me though, because I find that if I've experienced it, I know surely someone else has. And I love for people to be able to say, wow, I really saw myself in this, or I really related to that because I experienced something similar, or, you know, like it just felt like a friend group that I wanted to be a part of because of the way that they kind of manage themselves and the way that they kind of pick at each other, but also support each other. And so for me, like, even through like the terrible online dates, which some of those may be inspired by real events, to, you know, meeting someone randomly at the gym, to the experiences that Savvy had when she was dealing with the online dates and the weird people that lick their lips like LL Cool J, right? Like you have those moments where you're just kind of like, oh God. But if you've ever been to a club in DC, you've probably seen half of those things. And so it's just in trying to incorporate those experiences to make it relatable. I want to make it funny, but I also want people to be able to see themselves in it. And so I find that the more kind of humanity and even like humbling moments that you can put into it, the easier it is for people to be like, wow, I could really see that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry to make you run over here. So I read Zora before I read your bio, and I really liked how Zora championed young voices and underrepresented voices. And then I read your bio, and I was curious if you were inspired after writing Zora or if you inspired Zora.
That's a great question. So Zora was my pandemic baby. I have always been a writer in my mind. My very first publication was in second grade. The DC writing competition that's in Zora's story is inspired by my publication from fifth grade. And so I wanted to kind of bring that heart to her because in Zora's in a lot of ways like me. I'm all about community. I'm all about my friends and my family. I'm all about making sure that everybody's okay. And so Zora is that person in her world. And in trying to make sure that she is supporting kids, supporting community, getting kids published, doing all those things, it's funny how those things kind of mirror some of the things that I do. What I have neglected to add to my bio on my website is that I'm also a literary agent. And so I represent kids' books and get to help kind of advocate for diversity in publishing in a bunch of different ways. And so it's fun to do because in building these characters and building the circumstances that they find themselves in, you can pull like teeny tiny little facets of your life, things that you know, that you can kind of fuse in. There are a ton of things that I actually research because I don't know. Like for instance, for the book that I have coming out next year, I interviewed a professor of historic preservation. I did a bunch of touring. I will travel to locations to make sure that I understand the layout and the vibe and the atmosphere in a particular place. It just depends on which story I'm on. But I find that if you are talking about things that you've grown familiar with, whether through research or your own experiences, it lends a level of authenticity to the story. But it also, for the people who live that life or do that kind of work, they can see it and say, you know, that's accurate. And that's important to me. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. He's got a microphone for you.
It seems like your life was rooted in writing, the
Yeah.
literary agent, things like that. Was there a transition into publishing, or was there a threshold, or you just
Yeah.
kind of just naturally went into it?
That's a great question. So in my mind, I've always been a writer, right? Like since childhood. However, as people from different backgrounds know, there are certain cultures of people where they will get in your way and tell you, no, you can't do that. So when I went to college, I initially declared that I was going to be an English major. And my parents said, no, you're not. That's cute, but no. They were like, what are you going to do, be a teacher? And I was like, what's wrong with being a teacher, you know? And they were like, oh, you have to make more money than that. Don't do that. And I was like, okay. But that's what I really wanted to do. But, you know, especially like I'm half Asian, I'm half Black, right? In certain cultures, they're like, okay, you can do medicine, you can do law, you can do business, and those are your options. And that was my family. And so I majored in business law. I went to law school. I had every intention of practicing. And then somehow when I graduated law school, I had 25 mentees. And so the school approached me and said, you know, hey, you're kind of good at connecting with students. Maybe you should stay. And so I was offered a role in the admissions office at my alma mater. And I worked for different universities for 12 years. And it was kind of a long detour to get back to the place that I really wanted to be, because as many of my colleagues in the room know who worked with me in that field, we would be traveling all over the country, sometimes outside of the country. And literally, I would go back to my room after and be like, I have to go write. I'll catch up with you guys later. And so this has been something that's been kind of a long time coming. I took different breaks and wasn't sure if I was going to come back to writing, but I literally attempted my first novels in law school. And so having that kind of a workload and still knowing that it was something I wanted to do kind of told me where my mind was. I think when I graduated law school and started working, I was trying to throw myself into the work so that I could be really good at it. And so I took kind of a long break, maybe about 5 years. And then it just kept calling to me. Writing for me is a part of my self-care. I feel better about myself when I'm writing. Writing is the best way that I know to express myself and my feelings. And if I'm not doing it, I feel kind of bottled up. And so it's almost like it's a necessary thing for me to be able to kind of get those words out there. And sometimes these books help me deal with things that I'm going through, or things that process things that have happened. Like my first book, Savvy, the bad breakup that she goes through is loosely based on experiences that I had. Savvy is basically broken up with because she's told she's a workaholic, and her boyfriend had a problem with her weight. And I've experienced that. And so in writing that story, I was basically trying to find ways to ensure myself that I was okay, and also to like kind of move past it, to create closure for myself where I didn't feel like I'd had it before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, I just want to thank y'all so much for being here. I was really worried that I was going to be alone in this room, but I'm grateful for everyone that's present, and I hope that you enjoy the story as much as I enjoyed writing it.